Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friend, Sam Clement. Sam, say hello.
Hey, John.
How are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing fantastic. I hope you are.
I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking. I'm doing much better than I think a lot of corporate CFOs right now are, particularly worrying about maybe some of the proposals of increasing the corporate tax rate, at least at the national level, here in the administration's plans to raise revenue for a number of different projects.
I'd,
So
uh, I, I mean, I'd agree. A 33% tax hike for some of these large corporations probably isn't too fun for the CFO's office right now.
And Sam, I think, more than maybe some other taxes, this might have some public goodwill or support because increasingly it seems as though larger elements or larger segments of our society are becoming more anti-corporate to America, if you will, anti-corporations just in general, as corporations are viewed as the big bad guys. And strangely enough, some of our largest corporations in the country are some of the more woke corporations in the country. And what I think is kind of frustrating about this about this talk about increasing corporate taxes is, people bandy about how a company like Amazon uses this, that, or the other thing to reduce their corporate taxation here in the United States, and how Apple has all this revenue from overseas that's not taxed at U.S. tax rates, and they throw out some of the biggest corporations just in general, and kind of take the top companies in the world and say, take a look at this, whereas they're not really focusing in on the mom and pop or the smaller companies that are also going to have to pay this increase, proposed increase in corporate taxes. Sam, your thoughts on that?
Well, and you brought up a good point about the companies generally mentioned by this are the larger corporations. And another tax increase, it's not really the point of the episode, but the capital gains tax increase isn't really for increased revenue. The more you look at it, and you see some economists that kind of look at it and say, okay, this really isn't going to generate much more revenue by moving these tax rates up. And it really looks and feels more punitive than anything else. And that's where I think the support that you're seeing is rallying behind is punishing some of these larger corporations. Not, okay, what's a fair rate? What can we get out of these people? What out of these companies? What services are they providing? What benefits are they providing us? It's not a logical thought breakdown of what the appropriate tax rate should be compared to other OECD countries. It's Amazon is the bad guy, Apple's the bad guy, any of those large companies is the bad guy, and they need to pay for it.
Yeah, and that's there you have it, and that's it for today. But Sam, I mean, you're absolutely right, and the thing about it is, whenever you do punitive taxes, or whenever you try to increase taxes in order to increase revenue, oftentimes, the results are going to be horribly ironic, because increasing the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28% at the national level. It's only 7% or something thereabouts. However, what people fail to realize particularly people that have never been in the business world who are making these decisions, is that corporations aren't just going to sit there and say, oh, okay, you got us. We're going to pay more and more in taxes now, and we're just going to have to accept a lower profit margin. That's not the way the world works.
No, of course not.
It's just not the way the world works. And corporations aren't going to go, you got us. All right, shucks. That's not the way it works. The CFO's office is going to figure out some way to maintain those profit margins. Investors are going to demand those same profit margins. So in order to do that, the easiest thing that the company can do is reduce expenditure somewhere.
It's either cost of goods sold, SG&A, or some sort of expenditure that they're going to slash and try and keep those profit margins where they are.
Because they can't just pass it along in the forms of increased revenue. Revenue is something corporations really can't control as much as expenditures, without a doubt. So if the potential tax rate's going up, they need to make the same earnings per share, or would like to make the same earnings per share. Cuts are going to come from somewhere. They're just going to have to. I mean, assuming that we get rid of all the loopholes and all that stuff, they're going to have to come from somewhere. And since your cost of goods sold, your COGS, for all your accounting majors out there, cost of goods sold really isn't going to change terribly much. And if you assume your revenue is not going to change terribly much, the next biggest lever you've got are SG&A, and the biggest component of SG&A are what?
Sales, general and administrative.
But what's the biggest? What's one of the biggest parts of SG&A? Employee-related costs.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. That's the low-hanging fruit. Now, apologists would sit there and say, "Oh, we've had higher corporate taxes in the past, and that didn't necessarily do anything to expenditures. It didn't lead to huge spikes in unemployment and all that stuff." And that might be true. That might be true. I'm just telling you what intuition suggests. Telling you from someone that helped start a company. This is what's going to happen. And so this is probably what's going to happen. Probably. If you were going to make a bet, this is what side of the argument, what side of the bet are you going to take? What are the odds of something happening? It might not happen, of course, but if you're going to bet your own money on something, I would sit there and say you increase the corporate tax rate and companies are going to cut their expenditures. And the biggest lever that they can pull on that is employer-related cost.
Well, and the other fault with this is it ignores the externalities that these companies produce and these benefits outside of their own employee payroll or their own net income that these large companies produce. And that's a lot of the reasons you see the quoted in tax rates that some of these large companies pay. And it's completely ignoring the incentives that they have. It's completely ignoring, the reason for those incentives and the benefit. I mean, the percentage of our GDP that comes from those large corporations is insane. And the jobs, the people employed by Amazon, it's well over 1 million. I think it's 1.4 million people are employed by a single corporation, them and Walmart being the two biggest ones. And so there's a reason we have tax incentives in place, is because what these companies are incentivized to do is lower the burden on the government itself.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So a 7% increase at the national level for corporate taxes doesn't sound like that much until really, Sam, you start doing some of the numbers. It's massive. And corporations aren't just going to blithely accept it. They're just not going to. And also, when people say, "Oh, it doesn't really do anything when you cut corporate taxes," well, what in the heck happened to Ireland when they took their corporate income tax down to 12.5%?
Yeah, there's a reason that all of these pharmaceutical companies, all sorts of tech companies are headquartered in Dublin.
And so, I actually did a little bit of work on this. And one of the things that concerns me the most about the corporate tax is the emphasis on, well, even taking it to 28% isn't going to be the highest in the world. However, that's certainly just that's true. I'm sitting here looking at some OECD numbers from last year's tax rates. And France's corporate tax rate, it would still be higher than ours at 32.02%. How about that? Portugal's would be higher, Australia's, Mexico's, all that stuff. The thing is, France and Mexico and Australia don't tax corporate income at what the OECD calls sub-central government, or at the state and local level. In the United States, the OECD estimates that our average state and local corporate income tax rate is around 6.03%. But that's not even the highest. That's just the average. I'm sitting here looking at a stat. New Jersey's is 11.5. So when you take the national or the central government's income tax increase from 21 to 28% and put 11.5% on it for companies headquartered in New Jersey, and I'm not talking about just these big S&P 500 companies. I'm talking about people making euros as well. If they're a C corp, they're making euros. They're making shoelaces, stuff like that. All of a sudden, you start taking a look at that's 40%.
Oh, yeah, that's close to 40%.
And you're going to tell me
off the top.
You're going to tell me that is not going to be anti-competitive? California's is 8.84%. Iowa's is 9.8. Minnesota's is 9.8. Illinois is 9.5. I mean, you tackle that on, And yeah, all of a sudden, corporate taxes in the US are much higher than the OECD average. That's anti-competitive in my estimation. Our corporations have to work that much harder to make the same amount of money for their investors.
Sure.
And so that is one of the things that I don't think gets talked about anywhere near enough, is that we also tax at the state level.
And you're right. It's not quoted. You see that comparison thrown around a lot, and France being one of the countries. Oh, it's just 28%. It's not even near the top of where France and those other countries you mentioned are. But like you said, those comparisons are intentionally or otherwise excluding the fact that this is also taxed on state and local levels.
Yeah, because Germany would still be higher according to the OECD at 29.94% for 2020. That's higher than the administration's proposal, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, only 15.83% of that is from Berlin. 14.11% is from the various states in the federation. So the national or the central corporate tax rate in Germany is 15%, not 29.9. It's 15.83%. That's the apples to apples comparison. So even now, on the national level, our corporate tax rate is still high compared to Germany's.
Yeah.
And so, we don't hear anyone talking about that terribly much. We just go with the national rates, don't throw in the state rates whatsoever. And then we have the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, going around trying to push some of our trading partners for a global minimum corporate tax rate, presumably higher than the 12.5% that the Irish currently have, and presumably higher than the 15.83% that the Germans currently have at the national level. Otherwise, they wouldn't be going around. Otherwise, Mrs. Yellen wouldn't be going around doing that. Your thoughts?
That's it. They want to raise the level so that we can raise ours while also keeping it at a somewhat level playing field. So drag everyone else, I guess instead of down, drag everyone up with us.
Riddle me this. Think of yourself as head of the Treasury in Dublin. Why would I do
that? Maybe I want to, no longer have all these large businesses headquartered in my country. That's the goal.
In Berlin, why would I want to do this?
Same reason. Kick all these large companies out.
Yeah, the Canadians. The Canadians, which have a similar federal structure as we do, the Canadians, their national corporate tax rate's 15% according to the OECD, and the provinces are at around 11.15%. So why would Pretty Boy Trudeau up there, right? You want to call him Pretty Boy?
Well, he doesn't make sense, so I don't know why he would do anything. Just about.
But why would he say, "Yeah, you're right, Janet. I think we need to increase this at the national level so we can be as anti-competitive as you are."
He may say that though.
And then there's the simple fact, Sam. We've done a lot of work on this. The only way that I can think of that is 100% fail-proof, 100% fail-proof of increasing tax receipts, if that is really what the goal should be, and I would argue it's not. The only way, it doesn't matter, the only way is to grow wealth and grow economic activity in the country. You do that, you will increase your tax revenues.
It's like we talked about again. I'll bring up the capital gains part of this because they kind of go hand in hand in my mind. It's pretty much a fact that raising the capital gains this much is not going to raise the taxes that we're bringing in, the income that we're bringing in off taxes. All it's going to do is force people to not sell assets as much and then figure out other ways to get around capital gains. And it's going to actually end up lowering the income that we're receiving from the capital gains. And so clearly it's not about how much money we're bringing in for taxes. It's very clearly punitive. And that's if Democratic economists are saying this probably isn't going to bring in more revenue, then it's clearly not for bringing in more revenue.
No, no, you're absolutely right. It's just for freezing large amounts of capital in the system.
And that's all it does.
Yeah, that's all it does. And then, going back to what we were talking about, increasing economic activity, increasing the flow of capital throughout the system, which should generate more economic activity, and then just the creation of wealth in society, and understanding that wealth creation can sometimes be unequal, without a doubt. However, would you want to have a larger slice of a small pizza, or the same size slice of a much larger pizza? Catch my drift?
And that's always needs to be the question. And in my mind, we're already printing so much new money, and we're already 80+% of it right now is not funded. Why not just make it 100%? Why are we trying to make ourselves less competitive when this clearly isn't a viable solution to fund our current spending levels and our current need to go out and buy and spend more money? Why make us less competitive? If that's going to be the case, why wouldn't we want to be more competitive if we're going to continue this amount of unfunded spending?
Well, that's the whole deal. I mean, if we're going to be throwing that much money on it, we need to be sticking our foot through the floor on the gas pedal, doing everything we can to grow the economy as rapidly as possible.
Well, we talked last week about possible weakening dollar, and our conclusion was that there needs to be continued demand for it, and there has been. The dollar has not weakened like some gold bugs have expected it to over the last decade, and a large reason for that is the fact that we've had continued demand for it. And so it doesn't seem to make sense to me that we would want to make ourselves less competitive to essentially take away demand for our currency when we're already 80+% of it right now is not funded spending. It's unfunded spending. It's spending from debt. And the reason we're allowed to do that is from the demand for our currency. And when we take away the demand for our currency by making us less competitive, it just all is going to fall apart. It's backwards to me. It's really backwards. And it's hard for me to understand how this doesn't, we've always asked, how do we get out of this predicament of how much money we're spending and how much debt we have? And we're just going to make it worse and make it more expensive to fund this level of spending and debt.
Yeah. Well, I feel as though there's some old white-haired guy that might have rubbed off on you, not in a weird way. But how can I argue with that? Really, I don't think I'm not sure how anyone that does this for a living could argue with you terribly much on that. And then I got to tell you, and I was talking to my 84-year-old father recently, and we were talking about this very issue over cocktails last Friday night. Friday fun night we call it, and that. And we were talking about this potential increase in corporate taxation in the United States. And I said, Dad, the thing that frustrates me is, corporate profits are enormous generators of wealth. Just enormous generators of wealth. And bear with me for a second. Sam, in the markets, market valuations and all that stuff, as you well know, there's something called the price to earnings multiple, right?
Yeah.
And so that is just simply the amount of money, investors are willing to pay for each dollar of earnings per share, right?
Yep.
For all intents and purposes, that's what it is. A P multiple of say 20 means that investors are willing to pay $20 for each dollar of EPS, earnings per share.
Yep.
And so understanding that, every dollar of earnings per share has the magical ability to create $20 of wealth for people that own the stock, right?
Sure.
And so if all of a sudden, if that price to earnings multiple remains relatively constant, what happens if that earnings per share goes from 1 to 2? What happens to the share price?
That magic multiple.
And magic multiple, all of a sudden, we're creating wealth as though we're leprechauns at the end of the rainbow.
Yep.
And that's good for society. Yeah, it might be unequal. Jeff Bezos might be unfairly enriched. However, if the goal is to increase tax revenue, if the goal is to increase overall societal wealth, I'm sitting here taking a look at one lever here is, that's fail-proof.
And it's fail proof. It's fail proof in the downside too. If we
Yeah.
start taking away earnings per share, that magic wonderful 20 that we're using as an example, multiple for how much dollars it creates. Same thing happens when it goes down. Same thing happens when you take $1 out of that earnings per share.
You take $1 out of that, and all of a sudden the share price goes down, wealth goes down. And then let's say that the CFO's office is going to go, we're just going to maintain the same level of EPS. Well, if my taxes are higher and my revenue is the same, again, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, what gets cut?
Yep, people.
Something has to be cut.
Generally employees.
It's either R&D or employees, that type of thing.
Which you cut R&D, you're cutting your growth rate essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. So an increase in corporate taxation in order to really kind of bully some of the larger companies in the country that, that doesn't pass the smell test sometimes. When you take a look at some of these large companies that are using, accounting sleight of hand. I mean, I got to tell you, it kind of bothers me too. However, that's the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah.
And so when you start laying on additional taxes in order to make sure that a company like Amazon pays, $1 billion in corporate tax, you are also impacting that small local business that makes $5 million a year.
And the other thing, even just focusing on Amazon and what that does, there's a lot of unintended consequences, going after the second largest employer. And it's a company that can't hire enough people. They physically cannot find enough people that would like to work for them at times. And they're expanding like no other company, new distribution centers everywhere, essentially. So if we start slowing the growth rate and attacking a company like that, the unintended consequences from the amount of future jobs that are going to be lost, and people put back onto government subsidies is, at least for me, unquantifiable.
Well, we're not picking on Amazon. Amazon has done a lot of wonderful things for the U.S. economy and employment and what have you. And this isn't about them. That they're just oft used example of how much revenue they generate,
yeah,
which they pay in tax. They're not doing anything illegal. They're adhering to the tax code. I hear you. So I think I don't think we're trading perspectives. I think we're spot on. I absolutely loathe this proposal on so many different levels, because I don't think it's really trying to raise revenue. And I can sit here and take a look at the math and sit there and go, okay, this is what happens to stock prices, or this is what happens to expenditures, and this is what happens to employment. And then, oh, by the way, we're not really talking about what we're taxing our corporations at the state level. You add that in, that makes us very highly taxed.
And I'll add in one other.
Relative to our major trading partners, how is that competitive? How does that make us more competitive?
I'll add in one other little tidbit. And I think some people that are pushing for these proposals say, well, if it hurts their stock, then good. Their stock shouldn't be valued that highly. Well, 40% of all U.S. household wealth is in the stock market. It is no longer something just for the rich. It is the path to retirement for essentially every contract employee. And like you mentioned, that magic 20 times multiple, that is it's beneficial to essentially every American now. That is any sort of contract labor, and that is the path to retirement, whether it's through a 401k plan, IRA, what have you. But the stock market is ingrained in who we are, in our wealth as a country.
Even public employees have pension plans.
It is all. It is you can't take it out of who we are, and the path to retirement for Americans. It is the stock market. And so to be cavalier about saying it's good that stocks should go down, if we enact these punitive taxes on companies, it's very short-sighted.
Boy, you and I are not trading perspectives. We agree on this. And Sam, we might not make a lot of friends with certain elements of society with our arguments here, but I just am trying to figure out a way where increasing corporate taxes is actually a net positive for the U.S. economy and for the U.S. financial markets, and I can't find it.
It's not there.
All right. Well, guys, thank you all so much for listening. We always love to hear from you. Also, if you have any questions or comments, by all means, please let us know. You can always drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, or you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. As always, if you're interested in reading more or hearing more of what we have to say or how we think, by all means, please go to oakworth.com and take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab for all kinds of interesting and insightful information. All right. With that said, Sam, I'm going to give you another chance to add some famous last words.
That's it for me.
That's it for me today, too. Y'all take care.